They say nothing lasts forever, but is that true in business? In this edition of The Bottom Line, we'll be looking at whether any companies are so powerful they can truly be described as unassailable. Hello, welcome to the programme, and this week we're asking if any company ever is unassailable, invulnerable. There's a ubiquitous fear around at the moment that Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix and Google, the so-called FANGs, are running our lives and taking over the world, that no one can dislodge them. It's an understandable fear, but similar things were said of Microsoft and before that IBM, or indeed decades ago, Standard Oil, or in this country, Marks and Spencer and Tesco. In the end, thanks to private competition or sometimes government regulation, most unassailable companies turn out to be more assailable than anyone thought. Well, I have with me a Guardian article from just 11 years ago on MySpace, a social network platform bought by Rupert Murdoch in the 2000s. The piece was entitled, "Will MySpace Ever Lose Its Monopoly?" It claimed MySpace was a natural monopoly and, quote, could eventually extend Murdoch's influence in ways that would make his grip on satellite television seem parochial. Well, it seemed a perfectly plausible argument to make at that time, but 4 years after that, MySpace had dwindled to almost nothing, and it was sold for $35 million. Could that fate await Facebook now? Well, what we'll do today is we'll talk about invulnerability, complacency and hubris within corporations, government regulation, creative destruction that undermines even the most powerful businesses in the end. We'll discuss it all, and I've three guests with me with some knowledge of this topic. And first, Sean Percival, who's an entrepreneur and investor with Catapult Accelerator based in Oslo. But Sean, we invited you on because you were a vice president for online marketing at MySpace in its later years. And has that experience, has it given you a kind of perspective on life since then?
Yeah, normally I say, MySpace, when I joined, was still a big company. It was 1,000 people at that point. And I usually say that was the first and last time I ever worked at a big company. So I quickly moved back into the startup space, where I was able to sort of grow and evolve faster and not have to deal with many of the issues I'm sure we're about to discuss.
Right. So the companies you're investing in now, none of them are kind of unassailable companies. Just give us some examples of what you're involved with these days.
Yeah, right now I'm actually investing in social impact. So I've actually moved to Norway, gotten rid of some of this American greed and actually trying to do some good in the world.
We'll come back to the MySpace story in some detail shortly. I want to hear more about that. But let me introduce my second guest, Martin Franklin, who's head of global marketing at Polaroid Originals. Now, that's a venture that has salvaged the leftovers of the instant print camera business, the analog print camera business. Polaroid, in its heyday, never claimed to be taking over the world, but it was apparently unassailable in its own niche, until it wasn't. Again, Martin, we're going to hear and focus on the Polaroid story in more detail later, but just connect Polaroid Originals to the Polaroid company.
It's a fantastic story. Essentially, they had a monopoly in instant imaging for around 50, 60 years based on Edwin Land's incredible engineering prowess. But they never really got to terms with the digital revolution and how to respond. And they went through two bankruptcies during the 2000s. And that was really the end of instant cameras and imaging almost, because a group of really committed instant analog film fans managed to get hold of the last remaining Polaroid factory just before it was decommissioned and set it up again and went into business as the Impossible
And that
project.
was just at the very, very literally, at the kind of almost literally at the last minute.
Yeah, almost like literally the dying days of, so they picked it up and they basically had to reinvent the technology again. And then, got to a point where it was ready to be sold again under the Polaroid Originals name. And
so Polaroid Originals is selling instant analog cameras.
And film.
Updated versions of the old one.
Yes.
And there is still a Polaroid company, a sort of remnant of the old Polaroid company, which is different to Polaroid Originals. And what does that do?
So the two parts of our business, one is the Polaroid Originals business, which is the analog business that everyone's familiar with, Polaroid from the past, making instant film and cameras. And then the other side is the licensing business, where we put the Polaroid name on other related products, largely in the consumer electronics arena.
Also with us is Dr. Kamal Munir, a reader in strategy and policy at the Judge Business School, which is part of the University of Cambridge. And actually, you study this whole area, Kamal, and you've looked at Polaroid, but you've also looked at Kodak as another example. What's the Kodak story?
I had been looking at them very closely through the 90s and then in the 2000s. I, in fact, think that they should have gone bankrupt before they actually did, because they were coming out with new products and, not really with a strategy behind it. The story essentially was that they were extremely reluctant to give up a very lucrative product, which was chemical film, of which they had about 40% global market share. And the product itself had gross margins of between 70 and 80%. And so, you can imagine the reluctance.
Tough thing to give up.
It's a tough thing to give up. Yes, that's right. But, at the same time, what I found is that companies would much rather have competitors come in and eat their lunch than do it themselves.
Okay, well, look, let's step back, because I find this whole idea of, the unassailable corporation, and there's always one or two, and at the moment probably 4 or 5, who everybody thinks, there's just no way anyone will dislodge them. And I was amazed, Sean, that MySpace, that Guardian piece on MySpace, is going to dominate the world. It's a natural monopoly. How will anyone ever break into social media once everybody's got a MySpace account? Tell us about your experience there, how it went from that kind of apparent unassailability to nothing.
I get this question very often. Why? What happened? And it's never just one thing. I typically talk about it's a concert of failure coming together in a great symphony to create what this is. But, it was many, many different things. Some of the top reasons, though, were just one, when you're acquired by a large corporation, it tends to change the culture. And if we look at Facebook, who is the dominant leader now, when they acquire things like Instagram, if we look at Google and acquiring YouTube, they were very careful to isolate them and not sort of infringe their corporate hierarchies and process and lawyers and all these things upon them. They allow them to run very autonomously out there doing what they do best. This was not the case for MySpace. And I would always talk about if I wanted to do a new product, push a new campaign, I'd have to fight and joust through, 10 different lawyers just to get to step one. So there was so much baggage with us.
When did you get there? You got there in 2009.
Yeah,
so it had probably passed its prime at that point anyway, in fact, hadn't it? Because it was bigger than Facebook for the first few years.
It still was actually in 2009, and that's kind of actually when it flipped. I actually started working in 2008 and joined them full-time in 2009. And I was in the office the day that we learned that they had surpassed us in users and traffic. And it was not a good day in the office, let me tell you. We were not happy about that.
Right. It's not quite the same as Facebook. It was more like putting your creative content online, wasn't it? And you could share your music or your...
It was very much about freedom of expression. You could customize your profile. You could have someone else's name. I would joke you could be the gangster princess on MySpace. You couldn't do this on Facebook. You had to use your real name.
What's really interesting, Sean, there, is that MySpace wasn't that age-old dinosaur. It was only around for, a very short period of time as those big and unassailable, sort of companies go. And yet, people began to think that, their dominance is forever. And I think you were also a bit unlucky, right, when you were taken over by News Corp. And then I think Mr. Murdoch went out and did a press conference and said, you guys are going to deliver about $1 billion next year. Yeah. And then meanwhile, you were sitting in your office trying to figure out, how on earth are you going to come up with that billion?
He did this on an earnings call, actually. And so when this came back to the office, it was like everyone freaked out.
He said, we're going to make $1 billion.
It's going to make $1 billion. And we were at 1/10 of that in terms of a run rate. But this, when Murdoch speaks, you tend to listen. So what then happened is we basically ramped up the monetization engine, meaning more ads on the page, worse user experience. The focus was on revenue, not experience.
So is that actually one of the key things that did go wrong? Is that if you push the product too hard, you undermine the thing that you're selling, and people say actually this is no fun. So because it was known to be quite slow sometimes, wasn't it? It was so
when you have 10 ad units on a page, and like we had this ad called Punch the Monkey, where it was literally a monkey that you would punch. They were the worst ads possible. They weren't nice ads.
What's Punch the Monkey?
It was like this little flash game. That was what the famous ad was. You'd see this monkey and you would try and punch them. And if you tried to punch them, you'd be clicking on the ad as well, and it would open up something else. So it was just a very bad user experience.
So your reward from hitting the monkey is, you can look at an ad.
Exactly. Probably more ads. But if we think about Facebook, they didn't really turn on the monetization until after they went public.
I think the rule is that you sow the seeds of your destruction. If you might have a natural monopoly, but if you try to milk it too hard, you will undermine the thing that the customers want. And the truth was, it just wasn't a natural monopoly because people were very happy to open new accounts on other services,
I think he did have some good foresight, though. I think he just, bet on the wrong horse.
Hypothetically, if he had taken over Facebook at that time and done the same thing to Facebook, he would have killed Facebook.
It's potentially true. We tried to acquire Facebook. MySpace did. MySpace tried to acquire.
When you tried to acquire Facebook?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. This is in the early stage when it was still private in college. This is prior to me joining. But yes, they flew up to San Francisco, Palo Alto, tried to make a deal. Mark was smart enough to say no. And some alternate universe, maybe that would have happened. And who knows what the end would have been.
But I think there's one more point I'd like to sort of, just raise here, Evan, which is the charisma of the CEO. And these, sort of poster boy CEOs like Mark Zuckerberg. Mark Zuckerberg has been allowed huge latitude in terms of, when he could monetize the whole model. And most corporations are not.
So you think it's easier with a charismatic...
It's much easier.
Yeah,
I mean,
have
Jeff
the
Bezos at Amazon, for example, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the kind of margins that he's been working with, Walmart would never be allowed to do
Let's
that.
talk about the Polaroid experience. Martin, you did not work there at the time, but I am fascinated in whether there are parallels in what went wrong at Polaroid. So when did it start to go wrong at Polaroid? I mean, was it just the technology change that came out?
Obviously, the digital revolution was a massive disruption to the industry, and everybody could see that coming. And actually, Polaroid were one of the best equipped companies seeing it coming. They were one of the first to have a major digital imaging lab, even at the end of the 70s. It was something that they invested in major. In fact, by 1989, around 40% of their R&D spending was in digital technologies. So Polaroid never had an issue with being a digital technology pioneer, but they didn't find a way to create a business model out of it. And they constantly avoided commercializing any of the digital technology they were developing because they were worried, A, that it would cannibalize their instant film sales, which is obviously a massive cash cow for the business with margins around 65% on instant film. And they were concerned that with digital, there's no real business model behind digital photography in the same way.
Because you sell the camera and then once you've done that, you don't have...
Yeah. So it's quite, when you have a recurring revenue model like film sales, it's pretty addictive.
So you could say of Polaroid, look, that was a technology whose time came and went. I mean, obviously there's a somewhat more niche demand for the tactile nature of the camera and the photo coming out of it, which is why you've got a business. But you could just say, look, that's one of those ones where there was nothing you could do. You had a great product, you had a great franchise, it went away because someone came along with something better. Is that not a fair way of just looking at it?
I think it's maybe a little bit of a fatalistic way of looking at it. I think when we talk about it internally, which we do quite a bit in terms of what should Polaroid have done, is that they essentially should have scaled down the instant film business rather than simply writing it off and thinking there was nothing left there. And if you look at our business today, what Polaroid Originals is it is essentially a scaled down instant film business, the way that Polaroid could have scaled down back in the early 2000s.
Are you managing to make money out of it at the moment? Or are you still early days?
We're starting to. Yeah, we're starting to. I mean,
I'll take that as no.
Polaroid is a fascinating case because the CEO of Polaroid used to be Edwin Land, and he was the Steve Jobs of his time. I mean, the guy had a number of patents second only to Thomas Edison.
And this is, we're talking in the
60s, 70s. I mean, and Polaroid was the blue chip, sort of stock. And it was Edwin Land who started doing these product launches that Steve Jobs later continued in the Boston Science Museum and so on. And my sort of reading of the Polaroid sort of case is that Polaroid was too innovative for its own good. And he bet the house on this product that, Martin's very familiar with, SX70. And this was an all singing, all dancing.
That's the what we think of as the Polaroid camera.
That's right. That's right.
It's the folding camera, so it's a very beautiful architectural, like scientific pioneer.
It went way over budget. Yeah. And the suppliers and the other stakeholders just could not keep up with this. So Polaroid had to bring a lot of other things into it. Polaroid was basically a design firm before that, and it became a manufacturing company after that because the others said, listen, I mean, the kind of things you're asking us to do with this, we cannot. So Polaroid had to bring all that in, and it completely transformed itself. And unfortunately, basically went bankrupt in the process.
What are other examples? I mean, come on, maybe you're best placed to think of them. I mean, it feels like both these companies, MySpace and Polaroid, could have thought of themselves as having an unassailable market lead in their sector. That's slightly different to Facebook, where obviously, or Microsoft or IBM, where there have been or are these concerns that they're somehow pursuing world domination. They'll take over our lives. What are some of the other examples you think of, Kamal, in this category?
So, I mean, it's very interesting because there are different sources of this feeling of unassailability. For different reasons, you can get the same feeling. So in the case of Polaroid and Kodak, for example, or even IBM, I think it sprang from this innate belief that we are the best, okay? And we can do anything, okay? Because we have in the past. And so you become more technology focused as a result of that, because there's no technology that we cannot master. And we have made so many products successful in the past that, this is just one more for us. In companies like Microsoft, for example, I think the feeling comes from a slightly different perspective. It's not so much that we can do everything because they have grown up with Apple. So they know whatever they do, Apple can do better. So, I mean, for them, it's the business model because they had a lock on the market, right? I mean, they had the operating system. So you and I, we used to go to our computers for the app. But in order to get to the app, we had to pass through a gate, which was the operating system, which was essentially an obligatory passage point for us. And there was a guy standing at the gate charging toll, and his name was Bill Gates, right? And so, it could be the business model, which they think is unassailable, or it could be the technological prowess of a company, which they think is unassailable, and we can basically do anything.
Yeah. You must have seen a lot of this kind of not hubris, but I mean this kind of self-confidence in your days in California, Sean.
Yeah, I mean, we're Americans, so we're arrogant as it is, but if you're from LA, you're especially arrogant. And that was the feeling, King of the Hill. Over 100 to 200,000 people were signing up every single day. So when you have this much users coming in, you don't even start thinking about things like churn and where products are starting to suffer. But I think I'd like to also push forward two ideas or two stories that have actually turned out positive if we think about a resurgence of a company. The first one is Lego. And if you look at how they've managed to reemerge, Nintendo, also another one. Nintendo almost lost, once again, to Microsoft. Xbox was taking over. It was becoming a dominant player. One product, the Nintendo Wii, brings them back in the game, and they've continued to grow. So it is possible. I think what's interesting, maybe for Martin in the Polaroid case, MySpace, not yet. Maybe it's too early, but is nostalgia, nostalgia, is that enough to bring you back to something? I have a lot of nostalgic feelings around Polaroid.
Yeah.
It's very tactical, the feeling, the shaking, it appearing. Is that going to be enough to bring people back?
I mean, it's a big thing right now, and it's a great tailwind for our business at the moment. But the one thing that's interesting about some of the numbers is that at the peak sales of ordinary cameras were around 200 million. At the time most cameras were sold. And now you have around 1.5 billion people with smartphones in their pockets. So there are more natural photographers in the world than there ever have been. And so we believe that naturally means that there'll be a certain percentage of those people who will want to print their images.
What age are you selling? Are you marketing them at, incidentally?
We talk about sort of combination of Generation Z and millennials. So it's generally around a 20 to 30-year-old market.
The Z is sort of 16 to
18 to 20, 16, 18 to 24, depending on how you cut it.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose what's coming out of this is whether the creative destruction, I mean, your example, Sean, Nintendo, it just proves there is actually a loss of creative destruction in the world, in the capitalist system, isn't there? I mean, I just wonder whether it actually just tells us that our economic system is pretty remarkable and really does just generate a heck of a lot of change.
Creative destruction has always been around, but the speed of it has just increased manifold. Right. Okay? So the smokestack economy firms, the General Motors of the world and sort of others,
ICIs,
they could, once you got onto the Fortune 100 or the Fortune 500 list, you could stay there for 50 to 70 years. And now companies struggle to stay there for more than 10 or 15 years. So because industries, that whole concept of industry, and we are the masters of our industry and we do it better than anybody else in our industry, has vanished.
Let's just go through what the different kind of routes of destruction for an unassailable corporation are. And in my head, I've got three. There's internal complacency or incompetence. There's the creative destruction from external competition. And there's government saying, we don't like the power of these guys, we're going to cut them down to size. So that's sort of internal, external, and government as forces that will undermine the huge corporation. Which of those three do we think is the kind of most important in all of this?
I think the internal complacency, because, that runs deeper. So what leads to internal complacency is success. So there are some core capabilities that have really sort of delivered for you. But over time, what happens is that the same core capabilities end up becoming your core rigidities. Okay? The same things prevent you from changing. And you keep falling back on them because they have really delivered for you. So complementary assets, for example, for Kodak, right? I mean, Kodak had...
What do you mean complementary
So
assets?
complementary assets are things that actually make you money. So in the case of Kodak, for example, it's not that, they could not do digital. In fact, the last 10 years of their life, it would not be too inaccurate to say that they were essentially kept alive by their digital intellectual property. What they did not have was a business model. But they kept sort of, falling back on what had worked for them. So the brand.
Your point is that it's the internal failing that actually did it rather than the external competition. And certainly not governments in the case of Kodak. And no one can say the government cut them down in the way the American government cut down AT&T, for example, when they thought it was getting too big.
Yes, and the internal politics as well. Because the politics are also a function of who's making the money for the company. Okay? So here it was the much bigger consumer imaging division, which was selling film. So the smaller digital imaging division, they were coming up with brilliant ideas, but they were just one floor below, sort of the big consumer imaging division who's paying the bills and so on. So, every time you come up with a new innovative idea, you're told, no, you're not thinking out of the box.
I think I'd like to add what Kamal's saying on this internal debate. And when I think about MySpace and other corporations I've worked with, it's almost like Game of Thrones, where people are killing each other. These executives get as deeply entrenched as the companies themselves. And so it's very difficult and rigid to work with this. We spoke a little bit about this. It's why big companies cannot innovate. Now, they speak about innovation all the time, and they go to conferences about innovation, and they do PowerPoints about innovation. But they don't really understand it. They don't want innovation. Innovation is risk. What a big corporation wants is the status quo and a margin that is slightly improving over time.
We're agreeing then, I think, that that internal complacency, or success breeds internal complacency and stifling bureaucracy, and it's really, really hard to keep that success and innovation going. Let's talk about the role of government here, because, there are cases where government steps in. Famously, Teddy Roosevelt, the turn of the century president, 19th to the 20th century, he took on the big corporations. The railroads at that time were seen as massively dominant, unassailable companies, and he was a trust buster who was going to take them on. We've seen a bit of that. Microsoft was taken on, wasn't it, by the American antitrust authorities. Is government a big, if you like, deterrent to unassailable corporations, or do we think in the end it's that they self-destruct rather than get government-backed destruction?
For these digital firms that we've been talking about, whether it's Facebook, so Mark Zuckerberg was on TV giving testimony in these Senate hearings. And I think the government has not been very active. And the government has not intervened where it should. 85% of online advertising dollars, I think, my figure might be slightly off, are going to two companies, Facebook and Google.
Yeah. Amazon's going to the extreme. They are now setting up, cameras on your house. They're being attached to your doorbell. They have a service where they can unlock your car and put the package in your car. So, they're not just encroaching upon your privacy in the digital sense. They are literally in your home. They're opening your door.
But do we really think Amazon is... Do we think we've now reached a point where we have genuinely unassailable corporations? With all the experience we have of companies looked upon as utterly indestructible, and we find, they do get destroyed after all. We haven't surely now uniquely hit the era of the truly unassailable corporation, or have we? Maybe Amazon and Facebook are, but I just, history tells us that no, we just haven't. We lack the imagination to work out what it is that is going to come along and knock them out of the way. eBay. What happened to eBay? Is still pretty big, isn't it? But it's not what it was, because Amazon has... I'm right on this, aren't I, Sean?
Yeah.
Amazon has
they
displaced eBay to a very large degree.
They've displaced many, and I think that, yes. Really, I think that one challenge we're having here, though, is these companies are hitting a scale that we haven't seen before. Is there anyone else that had 2 billion customers prior to Facebook? These are customers, and granted, they may only be making $15, $20 a year per customer. But once again, they're doing this across 2 billion people. So, a lot of people ask me this, will Facebook be disrupted? Will someone surpass them? And I usually think, yes, it's possible. Anything's possible. When I first heard the idea for Uber, I'm like, that's a stupid idea. And why would anyone want a black car to come pick them up? This sounds like a tool for rich people. Never thinking about the power of the platform and what it could be. If Facebook from today did nothing never changed their product, never did anything, and had a sort of single-digit churn rate, it would still take a long time to get to a point where you wouldn't consider it a meaningful business. So we're dealing with a scale that's just unprecedented. We haven't seen this before.
I think, isn't there a generational thing here? I mean, there may be the Gen Zs, we were talking about them earlier, Martin, and the Gen Zs may come along and say, Facebook's a bit uncool. My mum and dad are on Facebook. That's not where I'm going to hang out socially. And they will just migrate onto something else. To a very large extent, my impression is this has happened.
This is happening.
It just came out recently that,
And then in no time, Facebook will be... It'll be a sort of legacy brand that'll have a lot of life in it while we all die off.
So that is where, some intervention needs to come in, because Facebook might be losing market share to Instagram. But guess what? They own Instagram.
So you're losing to WhatsApp. They also own
They
WhatsApp.
also own WhatsApp.
So obviously you might want to be careful about
Sure.
Yeah, and they've tried to buy Snapchat many times. Several times they've tried to acquire Snapchat too. But this was also my experience at MySpace as well too, that millennial audience, the younger demographics, they don't have the loyalty that maybe we would have here sitting at this table.
I'm willing to bet if we reconvene this discussion in 10 years' time, one of Facebook, Amazon, Apple, or Google, or Netflix, which is the other one that now looks increasingly indomitable, I'm willing to bet one of those would be laughing about one of them and thinking, why did we ever think that was so powerful and strong? Won't we?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's the case.
Yes, I mean, and you're right, Evan, that, the next generation can make that big difference, because they think very differently, they relate to gadgets very differently, they relate to, sort of everything very differently. And the other thing is shift of platform. If you shift from your mobile phones, you shifted from your PCs to your mobile phones, and that ended Microsoft's dominance on the operating system. And so if you shift to your watches, for example, now from your mobile phones, that might bring about another wave of creative destruction.
Yeah. With Polaroid, it's a question of what your level of cultural engagement is. So the more interested you are in culture, the more likely you are to be a fan of instant photography or Polaroid photography.
When you say cultural connection, you're talking not books and films and music, or are you talking
all of the above:
Yeah,
music, books, culture, art, any kind of cultural pursuit. We thought millennials were sort of a little bit more cultural, but Generation Z, it's another step up, which for us is very exciting because we feel like that's something that turns people on to photography, and therefore
which
photography
is useful for your product. But I mean, the more different each generation is, and the more different each next platform or next technology is, the much harder it is for today's incumbents to remain tomorrow's dominant companies. Isn't that the rule?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
The theme of this programme has been that nothing lasts forever, and I'm afraid that is true of our discussion today. We'll leave it there. My guests, Sean Percival of the Catapult Accelerator, and formerly of MySpace, Martin Franklin, Head of Global Marketing at Polaroid Originals, and Dr. Kamal Munir, Reader in Strategy and Policy at the Judge Business School in Cambridge. Thank you to them. Do remember you can download any episode of The Bottom Line. Just go to our website. It's easy to navigate there. And I will be back with more guests next week. Thank you for listening. The programme was produced by Leslie McAlpine. And if you enjoyed this edition of The Bottom Line, you might be interested in other BBC Radio programmes, like The Briefing Room, which takes a single topic in the news and drills down into what's really going on.